Erowid note. This individual was sold something as ecstasy which they guess was perhaps ketamine. Since this time, it has become somewhat common knowledge that DXM is occasionally sold as ecstasy while there have been few if any reports of ketamine sold as ecstasy. It seems quite likely that what they took was DXM. An interesting experience has prompted me to seek out information from those who may know more about it than I. First, some background. About 5 years ago I was in an automobile accident that resulted in a stroke, which altered brain function in my right occipital lobe, who knows where else, physically manifesting itself as numbness on my left side, a not very coordinated left arm, due to spontaneous tremors, and a visual blind spot covering most of the upper left hemisphere of my sight. In the last year or so, I have begun trying recreational drugs, in many different venues. One relevant thing is that when I do dextromethorphan, Robitussin, my blind spot becomes very active, filled with a sort of hallucination, ghostly shapes and figures swirling or just staying still for hours or days at a time after I robo. Well past the noticeable effects of the robo trip, these images usually last 5 days to a week in this nether world of my sight. I've done DM probably 20 to 30 times and it's a fairly consistent reaction. I also noticed the same sort of hallucinations years ago right after the stroke when I was prescribed propranolol in an attempt to calm the tremors in my arm. Anyway, that's all stayed the same until just this weekend, when I was out raving, which is something I do very regularly, every week. But this week I was sold something other than E. From the effects of the drug, I'm guessing that it was ketamine, although I've never done ketamine before and don't know anyone who has to compare the effects to. It took like 2 hours to set in, and then became very robo-like, sort of numb, hard to walk, pretty euphoric, extremely dilated pupils, and it lasted at least 24 hours. Oh well. An interesting experience, but last night as I spent the night studying my differential equations, feeling very clear-headed from the drug, now about 48 hours past the time I took it, but still sort of noticing the state of consciousness effects, and very suddenly there were very strong flashes and activity in my blind spot. At once I noticed that things were very different. For one, I could see color through the blind spot, something I haven't seen there for over 5 years. The other thing was that I could detect movement in that visual area. All in all, not as clear or straightforward as color or movement in the opposite side, but a huge change, from nothing to something. The usual robo-hallucinations also kicked in, superimposed over the background new sight. I hadn't really noticed these hallucinations in the 48 hours prior to this moment. So, my blind spot is now about a third the size that it was yesterday, and I have a nice new portion of sight that's been missing for a while, and the hallucinogenic shapes are still there, although I suspect that they will fade over the next week as they do after taking DM. I'm guessing that the new sight will not fade, which I'm pretty darned happy about. I can't tell if my arm has changed. Not as far as I can tell. So I guess my question is, does anyone know anything about ketamine, its similarities to DM, what it actually does to your brain, and if anyone else has any similar stories? Or, if you think this may not be ketamine, tell me anything you have to say. As you may imagine, I'm fascinated by all of this.